Listen closely, my friends. You didn't lose them because you weren't good enough. You lost them because they could feel how badly you needed them. And that need, that invisible desperation you thought you were hiding so well, it was radiating off you like heat. They felt it in the way you replied too fast. They felt it in the way you laughed a little too loud at their jokes. They felt it in the way you swallowed your real opinion just to keep the conversation smooth. You thought you were being kind. You were actually disappearing. And here's the part that nobody says out loud. The people who hurt you most, the ones who took you for granted, the ones who left. They didn't do it because you weren't lovable. They did it because you made yourself too easy to lose. You made yourself an option while treating them like a destination. This video is not about becoming cold. It's not about becoming heartless. It's about something the Stoics discovered over 2,000 years ago, something so radical, so uncomfortable, and so deeply true that most people spend their entire lives running from it. The moment you stop needing an outcome, you become the most powerful person in any room. Stay with me, because what I'm going to show you today will change the way you see every relationship, every conversation, and every version of yourself you've ever tried to perform for someone else. What I'm about to share with you has been buried inside ancient philosophy for over 2,000 years. These are not motivational quotes. These are not feel-good affirmations. These are 12 battle-tested principles, forged by men who stood at the edge of empires, survived slavery, endured war, and came out the other side not broken, but free. Marcus Aurelius wrote them alone at night, by candlelight, never intending anyone to ever read them. Epictetus discovered them in chains, literally as a slave, and walked out of that condition as the most psychologically free man in Rome. Seneca lived them while surrounded by power, wealth, and the constant threat of death, and left behind words that have outlasted every emperor he served. These 12 principles have quietly changed the lives of the people who truly practiced them, not the people who quoted them at dinner parties, not the people who put them on phone wallpapers, the people who actually did the work. They are not comfortable. Some of them will challenge everything you think you know about kindness, love, ambition, and strength. But if you stay, if you truly stay, you will not leave this video the same person who pressed play. That is not a promise from me. That is the 2,000-year track record of Stoic philosophy speaking for itself. Let's begin. Principle 1. Stop performing, start being. There was a man in ancient Rome named Titus Flavius Vespasianus. Before he became Emperor Vespasian, before he commanded legions, before he rebuilt Rome after the chaos of Nero, he was a general who served under Claudius, and for years he was overlooked, not because he lacked talent, not because he lacked loyalty, but because he was, by every account, agreeable, accessible, easy. He bent himself around the politics of whoever held power at the time, and Rome almost lost one of its greatest rulers because of it, because he spent decades being useful to everyone else before he finally understood that usefulness without self-governance is just servitude wearing a polite mask. The Stoics saw this centuries before Vespasian lived. Epictetus, a man who was literally born a slave, said something that sounds almost offensive when you first hear it. Seek not that the things which happen should happen as you wish, but wish the things which happen to be as they are, and you will have a tranquil flow of life. Read that slowly again. He wasn't saying don't have standards. He wasn't saying accept abuse. He was saying stop spending your energy trying to rearrange the external world to match your internal anxiety, because that is what approval-seeking actually is. It is anxiety dressed up as kindness. Think about the last time you reread a text message 5 times before sending it. Think about the last time you softened what you actually meant because you were afraid the other person would think less of you. Think about the last time you stayed too long in a conversation, a friendship, a relationship. Not because it was good for you, but because you were afraid of what leaving would say about you. That is not love. That is not kindness. That is fear with good manners. And Marcus Aurelius, the emperor who had every reason to be addicted to approval, surrounded as he was by senators and generals and people whose entire careers depended on his goodwill, Marcus wrote this in his private journal, Meditations, a journal he never intended anyone to read. It never ceases to amaze me. We all love ourselves more than other people, but care more about their opinion than our own. He wrote that for himself, not for the crowd, not for legacy. He wrote it because he was fighting the same war you are fighting right now, the war against the part of yourself that needs to be seen a certain way in order to feel whole. Principle 2. Recognize the invisible cage. In 1965, a psychologist named Martin Seligman ran a series of experiments with dogs that would reshape how we understand human suffering. He placed dogs in a box divided by a low barrier. On one side, the floor could deliver a mild electric shock. On the other side, nothing. Safety. Dogs who had never been restrained learned immediately. One shock, one leap, and they were over the barrier. Free. But the dogs who had previously been held down, restrained so they couldn't escape the shocks no matter what they did, those dogs, when placed in the same box with the same barrier, didn't jump. They lay down, they whimpered, they accepted the pain. They had learned to be helpless. Seligman called it learned helplessness, and I want you to sit with that for a moment, because many of us are not living in cages. We have the ability to leave. We have the ability to stop explaining ourselves. We have the ability to stop shrinking. We have the ability to raise our standards and walk away from what diminishes us. But we don't, because somewhere along the way, we got shocked enough times that we stopped believing the other side of the barrier was real. You were told your feelings were too much, so you made them smaller. You were told your opinions were wrong, so you stopped sharing them. You were told you were lucky to be loved by someone who treated you poorly, so you stopped questioning it. And now you call it your personality. You call it, I'm just not a confrontational person. You call it, I'm just easygoing. You call it, I just don't like drama. But Marcus Aurelius had a different name for it. He called it the neglect of your own soul. In Meditations, Book 2, he wrote, waste no more time arguing what a good man should be one. Not perform one. Not convince others you are one. Be one, which means start with the interior. Start with the invisible standard you hold yourself to when no one is watching. Because here is what the Stoics understood that modern psychology is only now catching up to. The person who is constantly seeking approval is not a generous person. They are a frightened person, and the fear doesn't stay hidden, it leaks. It shows up in the pitch of your voice. It shows up in the speed of your responses. It shows up in the way your eyes move when someone you respect walks into the room. And people, unconsciously, automatically, without malice, respond to that frequency. When you smell desperate, the world treats you like a beggar, not out of cruelty, out of instinct. Principle 3. Warmth is not the same as accommodation. Let me tell you about Florence Nightingale. Most people know her as the founder of modern nursing, the lady with the lamp, who revolutionized medicine and saved thousands of lives during the Crimean War. What most people don't know is that for the first 30 years of her life, Florence Nightingale was one of the most approval-dependent people in Victorian England. She came from a wealthy family. She was educated, brilliant, socially gifted, and she spent years trying to be the daughter her parents wanted her to be, the wife that society expected, the hostess, the ornament. She wrote in her private diary, I am so afraid of being thought presumptuous. Afraid of being thought presumptuous. This woman who would go on to reform the British military's medical infrastructure from the inside. This woman who would write a 1,000-page report that changed government policy. Afraid of what people would think. And then something broke open in her, not gently, not gradually. She had what she described as a complete internal collapse, followed by a complete internal clarity. She stopped waiting for permission. She stopped softening her convictions. She stopped making herself palatable. And the world, which had spent 30 years being politely indifferent to Florence Nightingale, suddenly couldn't stop talking about her. The Stoics would have recognized exactly what happened. Epictetus wrote, "No man is free who is not master of himself." Florence Nightingale became free the moment she stopped negotiating her purpose against other people's comfort. And this is the distinction that most people miss. There is a difference between warmth and accommodation. Warmth is genuine. It flows from abundance. It says, "I care about you and I'm choosing to show it." Accommodation is fear. It flows from scarcity. It says, "I need you to be okay with me, so I'll reshape myself until you are." Warmth makes you magnetic. Accommodation makes you invisible. And the painful irony is this: the more you accommodate, the more resentment builds, not just in you, in them. Because on some level, and this is deeply psychological, people do not respect the person who folds. They may enjoy the convenience of it. They may even depend on it, but they do not respect it. The Stoic philosopher Seneca said, "Omnia aliena sunt, tempus tantum nostrum est." Everything is alien to us. Time alone is ours. And you are spending your time, your only real possession, performing a version of yourself designed to be accepted by people who would respect you far more if you simply stopped trying. Principle 4. Master the pause before you respond. In 480 BC, at the Battle of Thermopylae, the Spartan king Leonidas stood at a narrow mountain pass with 300 men against an army of, depending on the historical account, somewhere between 100,000 and 2.5 million Persian soldiers. The Persian general Xerxes sent a messenger with a simple demand: "Lay down your weapons." Leonidas paused. He didn't panic. He didn't scramble for a clever response. He didn't start negotiating. He paused. And then he said two words that have echoed through 2,500 years of history. "Molon labe." Come and take them. Now I'm not asking you to be Leonidas. I'm not asking you to hold a mountain pass against 1,000,000 soldiers, but I want you to understand what that pause represented. The pause was not a delay. The pause was a declaration. It said, "I am not moved by your urgency. I am not moved by your numbers. I am not moved by the fact that the entire world seems to be telling me I have no options. I will respond from my own center, not from your pressure." That is what the Stoics built their entire philosophy around. Marcus Aurelius called it the hegemonikon, the governing faculty, the part of you that watches, evaluates, and chooses rather than simply reacts. And it begins with the pause. Think about what happens in your body when someone says something that threatens you. Not physically threatens, emotionally threatens. When someone dismisses your idea in a meeting. When someone doesn't respond to your message for 3 days. When someone criticizes something you've worked hard on. Your nervous system fires. Cortisol, adrenaline. The ancient fight-or-flight circuitry that kept your ancestors alive on the savannah is suddenly activated by a text message. And your first instinct, hardwired, involuntary, is to respond, to defend, to explain, to close the gap. The pause is the moment you override that instinct. It is small, sometimes it's only 2 seconds. But in those 2 seconds, everything changes. Viktor Frankl, Austrian psychiatrist, Holocaust survivor, founder of logotherapy, spent 3 years in Nazi concentration camps, including Auschwitz. He lost his wife. He lost his manuscript. He lost everything external. And in that horror, he discovered something that no one could take from him. He wrote, "Between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. That space is the pause. That space is where Stoicism lives." Frankl did not choose to be in Auschwitz. He did not choose the cold, the starvation, the deaths around him, but he chose, moment by moment, day by day, how he responded to it. And he came out the other side not broken but transformed. Now compare that to the person who fires back an angry reply within seconds, the person who can't let a comment sit without immediately defending themselves, the person who refreshes their messages every 3 minutes waiting for a response. Those are not small habits. Those are windows into the soul. They say, "I do not trust myself to survive discomfort. I need the external world to confirm my okayness before I can feel okay." And the world, every single time, will use that against you. Not always consciously, but it will. Principle 5. Be selective about where you spend your energy. There is a story about Cato the Younger, Roman senator, philosopher, one of the last true Stoic statesmen, that I think about often. During the final days of the Roman Republic, as Julius Caesar's forces were closing in, and most of the Senate was scrambling to cut deals, to save their skin, to be on the winning side, Cato simply refused. Not loudly, not dramatically. He refused to plead. He refused to negotiate with what he considered the destruction of Rome's principles. He refused to make himself smaller in order to survive a larger compromise. Caesar, who had offered Cato a full pardon, who genuinely respected the man, reportedly said, "I cannot forgive Cato, for Cato will not be forgiven." That sentence is one of the most Stoic sentences ever spoken by a non-Stoic. Because what Caesar was recognizing was not stubbornness. He was recognizing sovereignty. Cato didn't need Caesar's forgiveness. He wasn't operating from that ledger. He had already decided what he stood for, and he stood there, fully, without pleading. The modern version of this, the version that applies to your daily life, is simpler than Cato's situation, but no less important. It is the art of selective engagement. It is choosing which battles to enter, which conversations to finish, which explanations to give, which silences to hold. Most people engage with everything. Every slight, every passive-aggressive comment, every test, every provocation. And every time you engage where you shouldn't, you give something away. Seneca wrote to his friend Lucilius, "Recede in the ips quantum potes." Withdraw into yourself as much as you can. He didn't mean become a hermit. He meant be deliberate about where you spend your inner resources. The Stoics were obsessed with economy of attention. They understood, centuries before neuroscience confirmed it, that your attention is a finite resource. Every reaction costs you something. Every unnecessary defense depletes you. When someone tries to provoke you and you don't respond, not because you're passive, but because you've decided they haven't earned a reaction, something happens to the dynamic. They expected a response. They built their move around your predictable reaction. And when the reaction doesn't come, they are left holding their own energy with nowhere to put it. Silence in this context is not weakness. Silence is the most expensive gift you can refuse to give. Principle 6. Release the need to be understood. Here is something that will either deeply comfort you or deeply unsettle you, depending on where you are right now. You will never fully be understood by another human being. Not your partner, not your closest friend, not your parent who has known you since before you could speak. Because every person you know is filtering you through the lens of their own experiences, their own wounds, their own needs, their own story. When they judge you, they are partly judging themselves. When they misread you, they are reading themselves into you. When they dismiss you, they are protecting something in themselves from what you represent. This is not cynicism. This is Marcus Aurelius. In Meditations, Book 4, he wrote, "Never esteem anything as of advantage to you that will make you break your word or lose your self-respect." He was writing to himself. In the middle of running the most powerful empire in the world, surrounded by people who praised him, feared him, needed him, and constantly sought to use him. And his private note to himself was, "Do not let the way they see you determine how you see yourself." The philosopher Epictetus went further. He said the desire to be understood is itself a form of weakness, not because connection doesn't matter, but because making your inner peace conditional on someone else's comprehension is a prison. If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid with regard to external things. Be content to be misunderstood. Let that land, not because you are careless, not because connection doesn't matter, but because chasing understanding from every person in every room is like trying to fill a bathtub with the drain open. You will exhaust yourself and never feel full. History is full of people who were catastrophically misunderstood. Nikola Tesla was declared mentally unstable by the very scientific community that would later build the modern world on his ideas. He died alone in a hotel room, in debt, dismissed. Semmelweis, the doctor who discovered that doctors should wash their hands before delivering babies, was laughed out of the medical community for the idea. He eventually had a breakdown and died in a psychiatric institution. Within years of his death, Pasteur proved him completely correct. Van Gogh sold one painting in his lifetime. The world did not understand them, and that non-understanding was not a verdict on their worth. It was a verdict on the limitations of the world at that moment. Now, you are not necessarily Tesla or Van Gogh, but the principle is identical. When you make your peace dependent on being correctly perceived, you hand your peace to people who barely understand themselves. The Stoic alternative is not arrogance. It is not dismissiveness. It is the quiet act of deciding that you are the primary author of your own worth, and that the reviews, however welcome, are not the book. Principle 7. Love without losing yourself. People hear the word detachment, and they imagine a man standing in an empty room with a blank face, feeling nothing, connecting with no one. That is not Stoic detachment. That is dissociation. That is avoidance. That is a different kind of wound. Marcus Aurelius loved deeply. He grieved when his children died, and many of them did. He wrote about love and friendship with more tenderness than most modern writers manage. He mourned his teacher Fronto with what can only be described as genuine heartbreak, but he did not collapse. Because he understood the distinction that the Stoics built their entire psychology around. Preference versus attachment. You can deeply prefer something, a relationship, an outcome, a person's presence in your life, while not being attached to it. Not in the sense that you don't care, but in the sense that your fundamental stability, your inner ground, does not depend on it continuing. Epictetus used a metaphor that is so simple it almost sounds too simple. Never say about anything, "I have lost it," but "I have returned it." When his slave master took a lamp from him as a punishment, Epictetus said, "I have returned it. It was never truly mine." Now, apply that to the relationship you're mourning, the job you didn't get, the person who stopped calling, the version of your future you had built in your head. I have returned it, not because it didn't matter, but because the grief that comes from treating temporary things as permanent possessions is far more destructive than the loss itself. And here is the paradox that the Stoics kept returning to. The paradox that modern psychology has slowly confirmed through attachment theory and relational dynamics. The less attached you are, the more genuinely loving you become. When you need someone, when your peace depends on their presence, their approval, their continued interest in you, you stop seeing them clearly. You see the story you need them to be. You project, you manage, you shape-shift around their moods to keep them stable so that you can feel stable. That is not love. That is dependency with a romantic backdrop. Real love, the kind the Stoics talked about when they talked about amor fati, the love of fate, is the kind that sees clearly, that holds without gripping, that stays without clinging. It is the love of someone who has nothing to lose and therefore has everything to give. Principle 8. Build a center that cannot be moved. In 16th century Japan, there was a master swordsman named Miyamoto Musashi, arguably the greatest warrior in Japanese history. He fought over 60 duels and never lost. He developed a philosophy of combat that was entirely Stoic in its structure, though he had never read Epictetus. He called it hey-ho, the way of strategy. And one of his central principles was this: the moment you need to win, you've already created the conditions for your defeat. Because the need to win tightens your body. It narrows your vision. It makes you predictable. Musashi wrote in the Book of Five Rings, "Do nothing which is of no use. Economy, precision, no wasted movement, no reactive flailing, no emotional leakage." He would famously arrive late to duels, not from carelessness, but deliberately. His opponents, waiting, grew anxious. Their composure cracked, and Musashi, stepping into the clearing unhurried, would already have won the psychological dimension before a single sword was drawn. This is exactly what Seneca described when he wrote, "Nusquam est qui ubique est." The man who is everywhere is nowhere. The person who is constantly reactive, constantly present to every emotional current, every slight, every test, is dispersed. They have no center, and without a center, they can be moved by anything. Musashi had a center. Leonidas had a center. Marcus Aurelius had a center. And the question that this entire video is pointing toward is simply, do you? Not do you have the right opinions? Not do you have the right values? Not do you know the right Stoic quotes? Do you have an interior life that is genuinely yours? A set of principles you would not trade for approval? A relationship with yourself that doesn't depend on the mirror of other people's perception? That is the work. That is the real work. And it is harder than any duel Musashi ever fought. Principle 9. Bring your shadow into the light. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who spent 50 years studying the structure of the human psyche, described what he called the persona and the shadow. The persona is the mask we wear for the world, the agreeable face, the competent professional, the patient partner, the understanding friend, the one who never complains, never disappoints, never demands. The shadow is everything we have pushed underground. The anger we decided was unacceptable. The need we decided was shameful. The ambition we decided was arrogant. The grief we decided was weakness. Jung said, and this is one of the most important things ever said about human psychology, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Most approval-seeking is shadow behavior. The reason you can't say no is not because you're kind. It's because somewhere deep in your unconscious, you believe that saying no will confirm the worst thing you fear about yourself, that you're too much, that you're selfish, that you're unlovable. And rather than face that belief directly, rather than examine it, challenge it, dissolve it, you manage it by keeping everyone around you comfortable. You become the person who never causes problems. And the shadow grows. It grows as resentment. It grows as exhaustion. It grows as the particular kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who like the persona, but have never met the actual person underneath it. The Stoics didn't use the word shadow. but they described the same phenomenon. Epictetus talked about the tyranny of unexamined impressions, the automatic responses that drive us before we've had the chance to evaluate them. Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively about the practice of morning reflection, examining your motives before you move, asking yourself, what am I actually doing this for? For truth or for applause? The Stoic daily practice was, in many ways, a Jungian exercise before Jung existed. It was the deliberate, regular act of making the unconscious conscious, of pulling the shadow into the light, not to destroy it, but to integrate it. Because the shadow doesn't go away when you suppress it. It goes underground, and underground it runs your life. The person who has never acknowledged their anger becomes passive-aggressive without knowing why. The person who has never acknowledged their need for love becomes manipulative without recognizing it. The person who has never acknowledged their ambition becomes quietly destructive of anyone who achieves what they secretly want. Integration is not indulgence. You don't integrate your shadow by unleashing it on everyone around you. You integrate it by sitting with it, by recognizing it, by saying, this part of me exists, and I am not ashamed of it, and I am also not controlled by it. That is sovereignty. That is the hardest and most important work a human being can do. Principle 10. Set your interior before the world arrives. Marcus Aurelius began every morning, and this is documented in Meditations, with what scholars now call his morning briefing to himself. He would remind himself before the day began of what he was likely to encounter, not to catastrophize, not to rehearse anxiety, but to prepare the interior before the exterior arrived. He wrote, "At dawn, when you have trouble getting out of bed, tell yourself, I have to go to work as a human being. What do I have to complain of if I'm going to do what I was born for, the things I was brought into the world to do?" What strikes me about this is not the productivity angle that modern self-help would grab. What strikes me is the phrase, what I was born for. Not what will make my boss happy. Not what will make my partner stop worrying. Not what will make my followers grow. What I was born for. He was anchoring his day to an interior compass. And by doing that every morning, he was practicing, ritually, deliberately, the art of not needing external validation to know why he was getting up. The Stoic morning practice, stripped to its core, is this. Before you pick up your phone, before you check your messages, before you see what the world needs from you today, spend 5 minutes knowing what you need from yourself. Not what you want, not what would feel nice, what you need, what your principles require, what the person you are trying to become would do. Then go and do it. And when the world starts pulling you, when the notifications start, when the meetings start, when the demands start, you will be pulled from a center, not scattered from an empty place. That is the difference between a person who has a good day and a person who survives the day. Principle 11. Review yourself each evening without mercy and without cruelty. Before the Stoics, the Pythagoreans practiced a nightly review. Seneca, who was deeply influenced by both traditions, described it this way. When the light has been removed and my wife has fallen silent, aware of the habit that's now mine, I examine my entire day and go back over what I've done and said, hiding nothing from myself, passing nothing by. He asked himself 3 questions. What fault did I correct today? What weakness did I resist today? Where am I still not myself? Not. Did I achieve enough? Not. Did people like me? Not. Did I win the argument? Where am I still not myself? That question is devastating in the best possible way, because it assumes radically, uncomfortably, that there is a self to return to, not a self that needs to be constructed through achievement, not a self that emerges once enough people validate you, a self that already exists, waiting for you to inhabit it fully. The evening review is not self-punishment. Seneca was very clear on this. He said, "I do not torment myself, for I come not as a judge, but as a witness." A witness, not a prosecutor. You are not trying to convict yourself of your failures. You are trying to see yourself clearly, because clarity is the beginning of change. And this practice, done daily, done honestly, builds something over time that no external achievement can build. It builds the ability to be alone with yourself without needing to escape. Most people cannot sit alone in silence for 5 minutes without reaching for their phone, because the silence confronts them with themselves, and the self they find there, the one shaped by unexamined fears, inherited opinions, unconscious patterns, is uncomfortable to meet. The Stoic practice makes that meeting less frightening. It makes it familiar. And familiarity with yourself is the foundation of every genuine strength you will ever have. Principle 12. Stop explaining, stop justifying, just be. I want to talk for a moment about a specific behavior that I think is one of the most subtle and most destructive forms of approval seeking. It is the long explanation. You know the one. Someone questions your decision. Someone raises an eyebrow at your choice. Someone says something that even slightly implies you might be wrong. And you write 3 paragraphs, or you speak for 10 minutes, or you send the voice note, the long one, the one where your voice gets a little tighter, a little faster, a little more urgent, because you can feel them not being convinced, and you need them to be convinced, because you're not convinced yourself. That need to explain is not a communication style. It is a symptom. It says, I have not yet decided that my choices are mine to make. I am still seeking a jury, and I will not rest until I get a verdict in my favor. The Stoics were ruthless about this. Cato the Younger was known for being almost impossible to argue with, not because he was aggressive, but because he simply didn't enter the argument. He stated his position once, clearly, and then he was done. If you disagreed, that was your right. He wasn't there to convince you. Epictetus said, "If anyone tells you that a certain person speaks ill of you, do not make excuses about what is said of you, but answer, 'He was ignorant of my other faults, else he would not have mentioned these alone.'" That is not sarcasm. That is complete indifference to the verdict of people who haven't earned the right to deliver one. The person who has mastered this doesn't say nothing out of insecurity. They say less out of sufficiency. There is a difference. The insecure silence is tight, withdrawn, performing indifference. The sufficient silence is open, steady, genuinely untroubled. You can feel the difference in your body. The first is held breath. The second is simply breathing. And the practice, the daily, sometimes moment-to-moment practice, is catching the impulse to over-explain and asking yourself, am I explaining this because it serves the conversation? Or am I explaining this because I need them to like my decision? If it's the latter, stop. Say what you have to say in one sentence. Then be quiet. Let it land. And trust, actually trust, that your choice doesn't need defending. There is a moment in the Iliad, Homer's ancient epic, that most people skim past, but which I find extraordinarily stoic. Achilles, the greatest warrior in the Greek army, walks away. He doesn't walk away because he's a coward. He walks away because Agamemnon, the Greek commander, publicly humiliated him, took his prize, his honor, his dignity, and Achilles reached a point where continuing to fight felt like consenting to his own diminishment. Now, Achilles handles what follows imperfectly. His grief and rage, and eventually his return to battle, are all driven by attachment to Patroclus, to glory, to the image of himself as the greatest. But that initial act of walking away, that is pure Stoicism. It is the recognition that there are situations, relationships, environments, dynamics that you cannot fix by continuing to show up, that your presence is not neutral, that staying sometimes costs you something essential. The Stoic question is not, should I ever walk away? The Stoic question is, from what am I walking toward? Because if you walk away from one approval-seeking dynamic and immediately find another, you haven't grown. You've relocated. The walk that matters is the walk inward. Seneca wrote, "Nusquam ecce ubique est." The man who is everywhere is nowhere. And Marcus Aurelius, in Book 6. The object of life is not to be on the side of the majority, but to escape finding oneself in the ranks of the insane. Walking away from the insanity of approval-seeking, the constant performance, the self-editing, the shrinking, is not retreat. It is the beginning of a completely different kind of life. It is the life where you make decisions based on your values rather than your fears, where you choose relationships based on genuine resonance rather than who is willing to be close to you, where you build things not to be seen building them, but because the building is the point. Marcus Aurelius wrote something in Meditations that took me a long time to really understand. He wrote, "Love only what happens to you and what is woven into your fate. Amor fati, love of fate, not acceptance, not resignation, not tolerance. Love." Nietzsche, who was deeply influenced by the Stoics even as he rejected much of their framework, described amor fati as the highest affirmation a human being can make. Not, "I accept this," but "I would choose this again." Now, that sounds almost impossible when applied to real pain, to loss, to injustice, to the things that genuinely break people. And I don't want to flatten the difficulty of that. Marcus Aurelius lost children, he lost teachers, he governed an empire through plague and war. He was not speaking from a comfortable distance. But what amor fati actually means, practiced, not just quoted, is something very specific. It means that you stop dividing your experience into what should have happened and what did happen, because that division, the gap between the life you expected and the life you got, is where most human suffering lives, not in the events themselves, in the resistance to them. The Stoics called this prosos, attention to the present moment, not the past that can't be changed, not the future that can't be controlled, but the present, which is the only place where action is actually possible. When you practice amor fati, something strange happens. You stop being a victim, not because bad things stop happening to you, but because you stop experiencing everything that happens as being done to you. Things happen, life unfolds, and you, with your trained attention, your practiced pause, your interior compass, respond, not react, respond. And in that response, you are finally, fully yours. I want to end this video by painting a picture, not of an ideal, not of a philosophy, of a person, a real person who has done this work. Not perfectly, Stoicism never promises perfection, but genuinely. This person gets up in the morning and they don't immediately reach for validation. They sit for a few minutes in their own company. They set their interior compass. They go through their day and things happen. Difficult things, boring things, frustrating things, and they notice themselves getting pulled, getting triggered, getting hooked, and sometimes they get pulled, but they notice and they come back. They speak less than they used to, but when they speak, people listen. Not because they've cultivated some technique for commanding attention, but because they're not performing, and the absence of performance is so rare that it draws the room in like a vacuum. They say no sometimes, and they don't write an essay about it, They just say no. They lose things. Relationships end. Deals fall through. Plans collapse. And they feel it, genuinely, fully, and then they return it. They say, I have returned it. It was never truly mine to keep. They still care, deeply, about the people they love, about the work they do, about the world they're in, but their caring is not contaminated by need. It is clean. It is chosen. It is free. And people, the right people, can feel the difference. The right people are drawn to this person not because they are impressive, but because they are safe, stable, real. They are what Seneca described as constans sibi, consistent with themselves. They are the same person in private that they are in public, the same in difficulty as in ease, the same when no one is watching as when everyone is. And that consistency, that ordinary, quiet, daily consistency, is the rarest and most powerful thing a human being can be. This is what Stoicism was always pointing at. Not the quotes, not the disciplines for their own sake, not the cold exterior and the philosophical lectures. The person, the complete sovereign unborrowed self. Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Seneca, Cato, Florence Nightingale, Viktor Frankl, Miyamoto Musashi. None of them were born this way. All of them built it, daily, imperfectly, with setbacks and failures and days when the old patterns reasserted themselves completely. But they came back. Every morning they came back to the practice. And so can you. If you've stayed with this video this far, something in it landed for you. Not because the words are new, the Stoics said most of this 2,000 years ago, but because some part of you recognizes it as true in a way that goes beyond information. That recognition is your interior compass speaking. It has been speaking for a long time. The work now is simple, not easy, simple. Go back to one thing from this video, one idea, one practice, one question, and do it tomorrow. Not perfectly, not with a full Stoic life redesign, just one thing, the pause, the evening review, the explanation you don't give, the need you return. One thing. The philosophy of Stoicism was never meant to be a theory. It was meant to be a training manual for the interior life, and training, by definition, is not something you understand. It is something you do. First, say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do. Epictetus. The sovereignty you're looking for is not somewhere ahead of you. It is already here, waiting, quietly, under everything you've borrowed from other people's expectations. Come home to it.